Thank God.
It works this time.
If you only knew the saga, dear viewer / listener, if you only knew the saga. What are we? We're 58 minutes and we finally got it to record. It's one of those mornings.
Yep. Technology is only as good as the user, and well, we're still learning.
Hey, the user, I would like to express my extreme confidence. It, like me, just shit the bed just now.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I can really.
Your Honor.
I have no other excuse. It was the computer's fault.
Your Honor, my client pleads whoopsie daisies.
Whoopsie poopsie, I did it again. So sorry. So big week, huh? We're back.
Yeah, man, dude. I tell you what, our Market Garden series has gotten a lot of positive light, a lot of positive feedback.
I like that you're telling me this like it's news to me, even though I get all the notifications and everything that tells me that it's
not news. Joey, we know this, but we have to tell the people about it.
I'm sure you might not know this, Joseph. You ignorant wretch, but quite well.
But yeah, it's been great.
And then the Antietam episode was good too. John was great. That was a fun.
We threw a curveball.
Yeah, we did one Civil War thing and then made up for it by doing a bunch of World War II stuff. What's new? I have to do Civil War from 9 to 5, but everything else dominated by whatever else I want. We got some good stuff, some cool stuff.
Smoking meats in the Second World War. I'm basically a 55-year-old dad.
Look, the other day, because you're 29, I'm about to be 29. I realized it's almost over, man.
Yep.
I hit 30. This is going to become Homebrew History World War II podcast.
Yes.
That's it. It's just going to be, hey, did you know I just read the newest Anthony Beevor book? And it's like, oh, I thought you didn't like Anthony Beevor.
Yeah.
And then you go through this weird transformation where you all of a sudden become like, you're reading Ambrose and Beevor and Hastings. And it's like, wait, wait a second. Wait, you were reading some of the cutting edge historians and now you're reading them? What happened to you? I turned 30.
What happened to you?
And now I smoke meat all the time.
My white New Balances will be in the mail soon enough.
Dude, I feel like they're already. I don't think you actually put them on. I think they grow onto you.
Yeah.
Like you're just walking by one day, shit's just normal. You turn down the shoe aisle in the department store, and all of a sudden you look down, and like it starts out as like a little white speck on your shoe, and then all of a sudden you're just
enveloped.
Overwhelmed. Yeah. Anyways, that's what's going on in my mind today. So today we have a guest joining us. We got in touch through, I guess, a couple of contacts and got hooked up with Nathan Canestaro, who has just released his book, The Mighty Moo, the USS Cowpens. Up there's the camera. There it is.
You're so great. Oh, well, I'm gone now.
Work on yours because you got to hide whatever's in your background.
That's true.
What are you hiding back there, Bo? Huh? What are you hiding?
Drug money.
There's Nathan.
Hello. Well, thank you for having me.
It took a while. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right. All's well that ends well.
You've got an impressive bookshelf there behind you.
Oh, well, every author's supposed to have books behind him when he talks, right? Isn't that the unwritten rule?
I think that is part of the conditions. Terms and conditions say that we've got to be there. So all of that.
My background is what it is because I've lost like 5 bookshelves in a recent move that we just made. So all my books are literally stacked on to one another. It's like book mountain. And then I realized
you ought to make a shelf out of the books.
I can't.
You see where people do that?
Yeah.
They stack them up and then that would be good.
We have enough of the affliction to have enough books to do that.
I think you can get some what are they like the 2x10s? The boards and just do that.
Homebrew builds bookshelves. Say that 5 times.
IKEA Billy bookcases, cheap and durable.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what these are behind me. Yeah.
Yeah, these are great until they're not. once they fall apart, that's it. All bets are off. You're trying to put them back together. All of those have brand new replacement boards on the back of them because I'm just too damn cheap to buy another one. But holding on for dear life.
I think that's our product placement for the hour. Yes.
Yeah, that and drink heroic beer. Flying Tiger, drink heroic beer. There's that, and then of course there's always, since you talked about product placement, what the hell? It's a great time to remind you that homebrew history is brought to you. You got to drop it in there every now and again. I mean, breaking news: homebrew history brought to you by Civil War Trails. There we go. There we go.
If you didn't know.
So Nathan, we got you on talk about the Mighty Moo. Tell us a little bit first off about yourself, right? Because you've got a really interesting career when it comes to some of the guests that we've had on. We've got some of the the military historians, we've got journalists who have become authors, we've got law professors. I think this is the first time we've had an intelligence officer for the United States government.
So I guess I'm not your average historian. So how do I start? Background at University of Tennessee, and then went to law school, another master's degree in international relations, ended up working in the intelligence community, been there for almost 30 years now, I guess, and doing military analysis. And I think that sort of the way I would describe military analysis, it's sort of like history, but you don't know the ending, or more like a journalist. You're sort of going along and trying to figure out, hey, what's going on today? What does it mean? Where is it? How is it likely to break? But it's the same sort of subject matter that we as military historians grapple with, on a daily basis in terms of, the personalities, the opposing generals, the terrain, the information you have, and sort of the weapons and capabilities of the various forces, and plus the intangibles, the morale, will to fight. Mm-hmm. And I sort of transitioned from that to, from my day job into actual history out of an attempt to find out more about my grandfather's service in World War II. Mm-hmm. And he just, he was a lot like many other men of his generation. He didn't talk about it. He saw a lot of action. He wasn't comfortable, sort of telling me what that experience was like. And the few times I kind of pressed him on it, he started crying. So I felt pretty bad about that. And I, said to myself at one point, I'm like, listen, I research military operations for a living. Why don't I just start digging into this and see what I could find out on my own? And I didn't find out a whole lot about Grandpa, to be perfectly blunt. I know, where he served, that he was an enlisted man in the Navy, and the Navy's records focus on the officers. I know the ships he was on. I've got a few photos and, along the way to sort of document it. But in so doing, digging for, Grandpa's history, I found this incredible story about his ship, his aircraft carrier, the USS Cowpens. And the more I started, going down that rabbit hole, with very deep rabbit hole, I'm like, boy, there's a book here. It's a story I'd never heard of, and I figured, I considered myself fairly well informed on the war, and one, it's just sort of this classic underdog story about a ship the Navy didn't want. The captain was nearly scapegoated for the loss of his last command. The pilots self-trained in the planes they'd fly into battle. The crew had been in uniform barely longer than the ship had been afloat. They had this terrible jinx, the first few months of the ship's operation. And then, despite all this, they went through one of the, this tremendous typhoon, deadly typhoon, accumulated a distinguished combat record, and were the only U.S. aircraft carrier in Tokyo Bay when the Japanese surrendered. So I went looking for one thing and found something completely different. I said, I got to get this on paper.
It's one of those things that, you read more into it and you realize, there's a whole lot more I don't know.
Yeah.
About a situation. And that's seemingly been because Joey and I have been, interviewing authors really since 2020. And that's always sort of been the case. It's like, well, I started out to answer this question, but then I realized by the end of the book, I had 30 other questions that I don't have good answers for.
Yeah, once you start going down that rabbit hole, it can get pretty deep pretty fast, and then it becomes sort of an obsession. Like, oh, I got to find out all I can about this. Mm-hmm. So this was a decade from, I think it was 5 years to research, 3 to write, 2 to publish. So that was a pretty deep rabbit hole.
Yeah, I try not to go down those rabbit holes too often because then you never come up, and all of a sudden you're like, oh God, what have I missed for the last decade? I've spent everything devoted to one aspect. Oh my God, and then it sits in your closet and collects dust. The thesis research, it's just sitting there in nice
Yeah.
little box. Anyways, so how do we get to the Cowpens, right? Because when we think of the Pacific Theater and we think of World War II and we think aircraft carriers, generally our minds go to some of the big ones, right?
Yeah.
Yorktown, Lexington, Hornet. This is not one of the big ones. It's certainly not one of the most well known. And when you look at it, and you can kind of make out a piece of it in our background here, it does not look at all like an aircraft carrier, other than the fact that it has a flat top on it, and that's it, and that's being generous.
Yeah.
So, how do ships like the Cowpens come into service?
Okay. Well, I totally agree. I think the most charitable way you can describe the ship is it's a bit of an ugly duckling. Uh, in terms of the background, when you think about the big carriers, the fleet carriers, there's the Essex class, but there are a variety of pre-war classes that made up that. And I think we oftentimes forget as Americans how rough that first year of the Second World War really was. And over the course of, starting from Pearl Harbor through the end of 42, 6 U.S. flat tops were in service in the Pacific, and 4 of them were lost to enemy action. So the Navy had a problem, and they were running out of flat tops at a rapid rate. And to his credit, President Roosevelt knew this was going to be a problem. And even before the war, he was pressing the Navy to build more ships. He was afraid that the Essexes, which are already under construction, which were going to be sort of the backbone of the Navy's carrier arm in World War II, they weren't being built fast enough. And he came up with the idea, they had paid for these Cleveland class light cruisers, kind of a middleweight cruiser. They're already under construction, several of them there in the Camden Navy yards. And he said, well, why don't we just turn these things into flat tops? And the Navy didn't want any part of it. They want their big, expensive, gold-plated, systems, and they just did not want to be dragged into this. And it was kind of a shock to me as a historian. Like, the President of the United States goes to the Navy and says, I want you to do X. And the Navy says, get stuffed. We're not going to do that. Literally, they did. They absolutely rejected his suggestions out of hand, and he had to go back at them a second time and say, no, when I really mean it. I realize all your arguments have merit, but do it anyway. So they gave him one, the Independence, and this was essentially one of these light cruisers that they put a flat top on it, and it was about 50% complete when the order came in. Hey, make this thing into an aircraft carrier. But after the war got started, the Navy started realizing its problems. We took the idea of these little light carriers, CBLs, a bit more seriously. And every time they would lose one of the big fleet carriers in battle, they would queue up batches of 2 or 3 of these things. And they could be built quicker. I mean, an aircraft carrier takes a while in any event, but faster than the Essexes. And the whole idea was you just needed enough of them that they could help hold the line until the Essexes started to be available in large numbers, starting in late 43 into 44. So they were the label for this, the stopgap sisters. They were a desperate measure. Navy wouldn't have accepted them on any other circumstances except the fact they had their backs to the wall. And they filled the role. They were the right ships at the right time. When you talk about the Battle of Philippine Sea, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, half of the American flat tops in action that day were these little CBLs. And there were 9 of them in all, and the Cowpens was the 4th.
It's one of those kind of unique things because in American Revolutionary historiography, obviously we always hear about Yorktown, we always hear about Saratoga, and it kind of coincides with World War II carriers too. We always hear about the Saratoga, the Yorktown. What is so unique about the Cowpens? What interested you? I know you said your grandfather is kind of the beginning to, look into his story. What did you find so compelling about the Cowpens?
Well, part of it was, I felt an obligation to him, to Grandpa, to tell his story because he couldn't. And as I went along, one of the things that was special about the ship in sort of the post-war years, it has a very active veterans community and linked to a particular community. Cowpens, South Carolina is a real place. It's a small town of about 1,500 people. And starting in the late 1970s, they had a reunion every year, Father's Day weekend, for all the Cowpens veterans. And it's just sort of this love affair between the veterans and the community. And it's unique in the Navy, like very, very few other ships have this sort of reunion every year, same place, same people. But the community has adopted first the World War II veterans, and then the crew of the second Cowpens, which sadly was just decommissioned here about 3 weeks ago. They joke they're the symbolic home port, and every year the veterans from the two ships gather in Cowpens, and this little community just rolls out the red carpet for them. We just want to, show our respect and gratitude. And it's setting aside the World War II history. It's a great tale of what makes America great, that this community can honor not only the service and sacrifice of the veterans, but just sort of throw their homes open and show them this tremendous welcome. I was at the reunion this past year, and you tell people this and they don't. It's sort of tough to convey how tight that bond is. But when you actually go there and see it, it's incredibly touching. I was moved by it the first time, and I've been down, I think, 3 or 4 reunions, and brought my folks this year for the rollout of the book. And they had heard me tell the story, but when they saw it themselves, they're like, "Oh, we get it now." So it's special. It really is.
So a little bit about the ship coming into its own, right? Because we talk about how, it's right there in the subtitle of your book, from the Jinx ship to Tokyo Bay. So how does the Cowpens kind of get its start? What's the crew makeup look like? What's the first kind of 2 or 3 months at sea look like?
So perhaps the simplest way to say is to confess up front, this is not a first string ship. Okay. If you were a Naval Academy grad with a promising career, you'd be going to be on one of the big Essexes. Okay. The Cowpens and the light carriers were by and large staffed by reservists. So these are folks who have volunteered to serve in the Navy, but they're not going to continue their career once the war is over. A lot of them had never even been to sea before. I mentioned earlier, like literally, they're fresh out of boot camp. They've hardly, not been to sea. They have no combat experience. There's a handful of folks who aboard who are the professionals. The first captain was unusual in that he was a Mustang. He was a officer who had started his career as an enlisted man, which is really rare in sort of the pre-war Navy. But in a handful of senior officers who would continue on to the Navy after the war was over. But by and large, this is a ship full of citizen sailors and reservists. So getting them, the first challenge for Captain McConnell, the ship's first captain, was taking this mob of guys who'd never been to sea before and making them into a combat-ready team. And they were thrown in action pretty quick. The ship essentially, folks started showing up to the ship in Philadelphia and Camden in the spring of '43, and by early October they were in combat. So that gives you an idea of how quickly things were going together. And this isn't necessarily unique to the Cowpens. You think about, the Navy went from an organization of a few 100,000 to several million in the space of about 2 years. So the experience was hard to find. Pretty much everyone was starting from scratch in one way or another. But the first few weeks or months, through starting with their shakedown cruise in the summer and then getting into that first combat mission in October, were a disaster. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. The air crew came aboard. Their first landings were just awful. They were crashing planes left and right. One guy went over the side. They go into Norfolk for a little to restock and reprovision for their shakedown cruise down to Trinidad. Due to the inexperience of the crew, they get the ship caught in an anti-torpedo net, and it's hung there for 2 or 3 days. Captain gets an official admonishment for that. Once they get out to the Pacific, they have their combat mission at Wake, and they're sort of this deadly mix of overconfident and inexperienced. They lose 3 planes in operational accidents, 3 more are shot down, 4 men killed. If you consider there's an aircraft carrier with only 33 planes on it, that's a pretty significant chunk of the of the crew right off the bat. On the backside, once they head back to Pearl Harbor, one of their escorting destroyers collides with them, slices into its side, sends them into dry dock for 9 or 10 days. And finally, when they're in the dry dock, they have this fire. Essentially, somebody attempting to dump water into the drain of the dry dock dumps aviation fuel, and then the sparks from the welders fixing the huge gash in her side sets it alight. So there's this huge explosion. So it's at about this point that the crew is like, what have we signed up for? You know, people start talking about the Cowpens jinx. They can't do anything right. And it's just sort of one thing after another.
Well, I think it's really interesting, and you say it right there. It's one thing about the Allied war effort that is so often kind of overlooked, is how quickly things can be repaired, even when you've got a jinx ship like the Cowpens, where everything seems to go wrong all of the times. But that you can have a collision at sea and have that ship repaired in 10 days. Is just, that's unmatched. Nobody else can do it quite like the Allied and the Western powers could do throughout the Second World War.
Sadly, some ships had spent more time in dry dock than others. The Intrepid, actually, up in New York City, had a nasty reputation as being a jinx ship as well. They called her the Dry Eye for all the time she spent in dry dock, getting her wounds patched up. So, you know, sailors have their traditions and their superstitions. And, you know, once a ship gets tabbed as being a hard luck ship, sometimes it's difficult to reverse that. But perhaps Cowpens was the exception in that regard, because from that point on, things really started to gel for the ship. And they did finally turn into that combat-ready team that Captain McConnell tried so hard to build.
I think that's the industrial might that Yamamoto was afraid of. You know, I mean, it's terrifying, you know, to be able to do something so quickly and so efficiently. But, you know, Nathan, can you kind of explain to our listeners, you know, some of the combat experiences of the Mighty Moo?
Sure. So, you know, I kind of put it in phases that go with the different air groups. Now, the crew aboard the ship were essentially there for the duration. Folks come aboard in 43. Some of them were there until the end of the war. But the air groups rotated out every 6 to 9 months. And sort of the first phase, Air Group 25, they were the first group. And their crowning achievement was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Marianas Turkey Shoot. You know, they had a long way to go to get up to speed. And by the time they got to the Marianas in June of 44, they were actually among some of the most experienced fighter pilots in the fleet. Some of the other squadrons had rotated out. And they talked about that morning. Everybody knew a fight was coming. You know, the subs had been trailing the approaching Japanese fleet. And so everyone is up, you know, general quarters sounded at 3 a.m. Everybody was up and ready to go. And then the Japanese did not immediately appear on radar screens. And so some of the other pilots and some of the other carriers went back to bed or had breakfast, you know, kind of relaxed their guard. And the Cowpens pilots just sort of sat nervously in the ready room. Some of the folks who were there described it like a locker room before a big football game, you know, nervous butterflies and little conversation. And so they were ready to go. And when finally the Japanese started appearing on radar, you know, there was no briefings, there were no preparations. It was just general quarters, scramble, and a foot race up to the flight deck to get in any plane you could get into. You know, essentially the only thing they were told was, don't worry about your wingman. Don't try and form up with the people you're supposed to fly with normally. Just get in the air, head west, and essentially hang on your propellers for altitude. So the Cowpens that distinguished itself, this, you know, scrappy little carrier that started off with a bunch of, you know, second string reservists. These guys were the first aircraft off the flight deck from Task Force 58 there for the Battle of the Philippine Sea. They said it was less than 3 minutes between the order to fly and the first of our Hellcats taking off. So that's the first phase. Second phase would be the conquest of the Philippines. You had a new squadron, new personalities, didn't always get along with each other at this time. And this was more of a grind. You know, they were the front lines and sort of the logistics bases had moved closer to where they were fighting. They weren't going back and forth to Hawaii anymore. And so the ship was in combat a lot more the second time around. There was less transit time. And, essentially they spent 6 or 8 months moving up and down, north and south, the length of the Philippines, hitting anything they could in terms of airfields, shipping, anything they could find to sort of thin out the enemy forces in advance of the Leyte landings in October. And casualties, this was that 6 months, that sort of fall of 44 is when the ship took took the heaviest amount of casualties in terms of aviators.
In terms of just the general engagement, right? Because when we think of naval battles in the Pacific, it is dominated by aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
Right? It is a carrier war. We've moved away from battleships dueling it out over the seas. Where do you put a book like yours, which kind of follows the saga of one ship?
Yep.
We've got a great historiography being developed. Ian Toll's written so many great. He's got the trilogy out now on the Pacific War. I'll be honest with you, one of my favorite books is Horn Fisher's Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. I mean,
classic.
It's a great book. There's no other way to get around it.
Yep.
But those all talk about multiple aspects, right? In single individual engagement, but then also here's the entire U.S. Navy's involvement in the Pacific from Toll. Where does a book like yours, which really just focuses on the Cowpens, how does that fit into the historiography?
That's a great question. So, I think there's room for both, because I don't think the full story of the war unless it is both top down and bottom up. I love the Ian Toll trilogy. When it comes to sort of the grand strategic scope of the war, nobody's done it better than since Samuel Eliot Morison. I mean, Toll just nailed it. But it is very much a top down approach. He sprinkles it with a few anecdotes here and there to sort of give it a personal feel, but it is a strategic story of the war. It's fantastic. I'm a fan of Samuel Eliot, but anyway, mine I think is a little different in that I think the phrase sometimes used as a microhistory. Mm-hmm. Part of my motivation in writing the book was not only figure out what Grandpa did and what his ship did, but also what it was like. Mm-hmm. What were conditions aboard like? How did the men pass their time when they weren't in combat? What was the food like? What was shore leave like? And I think that adds kind of just this sort of the I was there personal account. I think mm-hmm. helps sort of add to that sort of tapestry and sort of give you a feel of, for those people who lived these experiences, kind of try and get into their heads and understand, what it was like my grandfather. My grandfather was a 22-year-old guy. From upstate New York. He'd never been anywhere further than Ithaca or Syracuse. And all of a sudden he's on a carrier in the South Pacific. What was that like? Just talk about a total perspective change. And so it tells a similar story from a very different perspective.
And I think it's one of those things too that, we talk about on the show all the time. It's like, do we need, another book on the Battle of the Bulge? Do we need another book on D-Day? Not really. And I think that's where a lot of these micro histories, and we always do. Of course.
You're saying no. I'm saying yeah. I mean, I can't stop reading.
always. Honestly, the whole point of why we do any of this is to, sell books. So it has to be, an important topic that can reach, a multitude of masses. And World War II is always, a prime subject. But I think books like that you've produced here, are important to kind of shed light on some of these things. Because I was actually listening. Joey had actually sent me a link to another podcast that you were on, and I'm not sure how long ago it was, with the Walter Edgar's Journal.
Oh yeah.
And you were talking about how, during the Battle of Cowpens, back in the American Revolution, a bulk of the colonial fighting force is militiamen, sort of the untrained, and that's kind of how the Cowpens itself, is kind of men that are, relatively untrained, or they're as green as the grass gets, and they're kind of self-training and self-preparing themselves for the horrors of war. So I find that link there very unique.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like you say, if the Battle of Cowpens is remembered for one thing, it's the role of militiamen, and then their sort of successors heading that name are newbies. These guys are a green, untrained group of folks who, like on the field of battle and there in Cowpens, did great things. They distinguished themselves, and I mean, the ship earned 12 battle stars, which is more than any of its other sisters, and even by the standards of the big carriers, that's pretty good. But only 26 months from when she set sail from Camden, Philadelphia, to returning and being decommissioned. 26 months in action, and then she was done.
Wow.
And then you mentioned the Battle of Cowpens, so I have to make this better for our British listeners. There is a really special bond that exists, though, between the American sailors on board the Cowpens and the British crew of the George V. I was just reading that last night as I was blitzing through the book to get ready for this, right? So there's that scene that takes place in Tokyo Bay, right there at the end of the surrender. So can you tell us a little bit about that exchange?
Sure.
Let me preface it by saying that, this, again, the little carrier that she wasn't one of the big carriers. How is it that she ended up in Tokyo Bay to begin with? And really, the reality of it was, we know with the sort of the benefit of history that when the Japanese said, fine, we surrender, they meant it. But that was not clear to much of the new U.S. Navy at the time. And there was, the commanders had lived through Pearl Harbor and all the terrible Japanese behavior that had followed. And so there were many who thought the whole thing was a trap, that the Japanese were going to invite us into Tokyo Bay on the grounds of pretext of surrendering and then swarm us with kamikazes and try and kill as many Americans as possible. So Admiral Halsey, who was in charge at the time, he needed a way, on one hand, he needed a carrier to go in there to sort of be the logistical hub and support the occupation. But on the other hand, he also needed to preserve his big, irreplaceable fleet carriers. So he kept all the big carriers out at sea and came up with the Cowpens. And so it's sort of this irony that, this is a ship who tremendous amount of battle experience, 12 battle stars. She was there not because of sort of the things that she had done and the skill of her pilots, the bravery of her sailors. She was there because she was expendable.
Yeah.
They could do without her. That was not lost on the people aboard at the time. One guy was like, yeah, I'd rather occupy a den of porcupines. Thank you very much. They were not particularly pleased with this. The Japanese ended up being true to their word, but Cowpens was one of the last to pull into Tokyo Bay. Now, it wasn't just her. They had put together a particular task force of ships. A lot of firepower there, obviously, in case of the worst should happen. And King George V was there, the British battleship. The British fleet had come relatively late to the game. I think they'd only arrived in the Pacific in July, maybe early August. And as Cowpens pulls in, the crew of the British battleship had lined the rails in honor to her and were playing the Star Spangled Banner, which for those aboard the Cowpens was a real treat.
I can imagine.
That's cool. That's a cool story.
Yeah,
it's a further proof of the bond that allies had. Not only in the ETO but in the PTO too.
Yeah. So
I'm itching to kind of get at this because you kind of mentioned it earlier, but you mentioned that the Cowpens in 26 months, from commission to decommission, but then you mentioned that there was a Cowpens Part 2. Right?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So I believe she was started under construction in 1989, commissioned in 91. So she's a Ticonderoga class guided missile cruiser. And I talked a little bit about the reunions and the community being, very active. And during the expansion of the Navy in the 80s, both the veterans and the town of Cowpens lobbied the Navy, said, we need another ship to bear the Cowpens name. And so the Ticonderogas at the time were being named after battles, so it was a natural fit. And so this ship was commissioned at the Charleston Navy Yard in Charleston, South Carolina, which I believe is sadly closed, and served until very recently. She was just decommissioned here in August of 24, and was one of, I think she fired the first Tomahawk missile strikes into Iraq in 2003. Spent a lot of her time in the Pacific, based out of Japan. Had kind of a checkered history, sadly, in terms of her leadership. There were some toxic commanders and some weird things going on in terms of captains. But the veterans that I know, the plank owners that I know, still think very fondly of her. We're terribly sorry to see her stricken from the Navy lists. And I know I'm helping out a little bit to try and convince the Navy that there should be a third Cowpens. You want to talk about a great example of Navy community relations. Cowpens is as good as it gets. This is a little town that is just begging, like, hey, let us, put this on your ship, and we're gonna wine and dine your sailors for the next 30 years, and they mean it.
And to carry a legacy forward too. The
Yeah.
legacy of a scrappy underdog, and you have to be. It's probably the most American thing possible to be the underdog, right? You always want to be playing from behind. You want to have the chip on the shoulder. And the Cowpens has that through the Second World War, and then the new Cowpens has it. So why not let another one come in?
Yes. Well, I'm hopeful, fingers crossed, bureaucracies don't move quickly, that there will be a third Cowpens. Right now, if they go by, naming Navy regulations, an amphibious assault ship, right now, those are the ships that are named after World War II carriers. So who knows? I know the town is working with the state of South Carolina and talking to Congress, and I'm trying to help out and doing a little trying to convince folks as well. So I hope, with any luck, the Cowpens name and legacy will continue on for a few more decades to come.
Bo, I think it's a time for a good boohickey.
Yes, and because I'm also itching to get ready to that too, because I also know too that there was a particular mural that was painted on the Cowpens that may have gotten Joe and I were actually talking about this before we got on the show, and I said it proves that no matter what time period in history you're looking at, we all have the same similar sense of humor, don't we?
Yeah. But a bunch of guys on a ship, no women around. It's going to turn into a locker room.
Yeah.
So just I won't get into details, but for the sort of the benefit of the readers, on the island, someone had painted a bull with a particular part of its anatomy hugely exaggerated. And that was sort of the Cowpens icon. And my grandfather talked about it, and he said that every time they came into port, they had to paint over that particular part of the anatomy because it would upset the civilians.
I bet so. There's nothing like Navy humor. That's for sure.
Oh, is this boohickey, or are we talking about a cock and bull story?
He'll be here all week, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Good night, everybody.
Yep. All right.
Try the meal.
What's the boohickey behind it, Bo? Come on.
Yeah, Nathan. So what's something that people have either falsely thought about the Cowpens, something that is either blown out of proportion, something you want to debunk about the Cowpens?
The thing I always get, we talk about the ship, is they say, "Oh, that was a Jeep carrier." I'm like, no. Okay, so broadly speaking, there were sort of three different categories of aircraft carriers. There was the fleet carriers, the big ones. Those are the ones you think of when you think World War II aircraft carrier. We'll set those aside. At the other end of the spectrum were the escort carriers, or Jeep carriers. And essentially, these were converted merchant ships or oilers, and they put a flat top on them. Mm-hmm. And they did use them for combat action. Oftentimes, they were the ones that were lingering offshore when there was an amphibious invasion going on, but they weren't fast enough to keep up with the fleet. They could manage 13 to 15 knots or something like that. They spent a lot of their time shuttling aircraft back and forth across the Pacific. Like if Cowpens or the Essex ran out of aircraft, they had lost some in combat, an escort carrier would show up and they would hand over replacement pilots. The CBLs were somewhere in the middle. Yes, they were a converted ship, but they were fast. They could manage 31, 32 knots. So this was fast enough to keep up with the big carriers. So yes, that's always it. Oh, that was a Jeep carrier. I'm like, okay, hold on. Just let's start from scratch here.
It is amazing that even in like a super well-read community, you still have to sometimes set back and break things down again and go all the way back to square one with something like a difference in the carriers. It's homebrew history. We're recording this. It's a little bit before noon, so I guess drinks do count now, or don't they?
No, they don't count until after the clock strikes noon.
Okay, so then we're still in the free drink world. What's in your cup, good sir?
Yes. As someone who has worked later today, it is a little boring. But I actually have a blue Powerade Zero cup to get those electrolytes replaced after this past weekend.
I'm not much better. I am rocking the diet cherry Diet Coke or the cherry diet. Cherry Coca-Cola Zero. However, when the sun is over the yard arm in about 4 hours, I hope there will be bourbon in my cup, which is usually my drink of choice. So I make a mean Manhattan, but we could talk for hours on the relative merits of sipping bourbons.
I was going to say you're in good company then.
I do actually have a sipping bourbon sitting here. And Bo, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, potential episode forthcoming. But I went out last weekend and picked up a bottle of Uncle Nearest.
Oh, I don't know that one.
It's a Tennessee Shelbyville, based out of Shelbyville. So it is a Tennessee bourbon.
I'm writing that down.
But it's actually, so the master distiller, the history, the story behind Uncle Nearest is that the master distiller Nearest Green actually taught Jack Daniels how to make whiskey. And so this is really like the progeny of the original recipe, and it is it's delicious. So we actually hope to have Fawn Weaver, who wrote her book Love and Whiskey, on the show very soon to tell us a little bit more about Uncle Nearest and his relationship with Jack Daniels and how the history behind bourbon sometimes gets a little boohickied up from time to time.
That's a great title for a book.
Yeah, it is. Love and Whiskey. You know, now you're thinking, Love and the Mighty Moo. Yeah, that could have worked.
You've read the book, so there is some language in there on how people were trying to distill stuff down in the bowels of the ship, and everyone got a liquor supply they could take ashore. It's just they didn't do this dry.
Yeah,
that good old toilet wine and bathtub shine.
Raisin Jack was apparently what the enlisted did, which is like raisin, water, yeast, and sugar, and you just sort of set it in the sun and let it ferment for about a week. And apparently, it was tolerable. It did the job, but it wasn't anything to be proud of.
That's right.
Sometimes it really is just about being passable. I think back to some of the stuff, Bo, you and I could have drank and did drink.
Yeah.
And, shocking. Last night we went out to dinner. So this will be coming out a week later than normal. But this week is my wife and I's 3rd anniversary. So we went out for dinner last night.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I don't know what it is. I see a fruity drink on the menu and I'm like, oh, yep, got to try that. Largely because I know that my tolerance is such that I can have like 10 of them and be like just gung-ho ready to rock and roll. So I ordered a drink. I got this, it's called the charred grapefruit. And I was like, oh, I like grapefruit. I like charred things. It has the Red Eddie, the grapefruit vodka in it. Yeah, let's do it. So I get that. Then Catherine goes and she says, I'll have a gin and tonic. I was like, okay. All right. So they're going to bring me this little frou-frou martini glass with a twisted grapefruit chard on top of it. And you're going to sit there. We have to switch. I couldn't switch. My drink was perfect. Hers was so strong. I could feel the elderberry going up my nose. I was like, I know I should be the one drinking this. I know I should be. But I'm going to have this nice frou-frou soft little glass here instead. But yeah. So there's that. Anyhow, Nathan, the book is called The Mighty Moo, the USS Cowpens and the Epic World War II Journey from Drink Ship to the Navy's first carrier in Tokyo Bay. It is available at all good bookstores online. Check it out. And Nathan, any last thoughts, any last words for the homebrew crew out there?
Well, hey, I'm happy for the opportunity. Thanks very much for having me on. As I mentioned, this isn't just my grandfather's story, but also I feel like an obligation to a lot of families and veterans that I've met. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to tell as many people as I can about it.
And this podcast is the perfect platform to do it on. And we want to thank again our sponsors at Civil War Trails. Homebrew History, brought to you by Civil War Trails. Get out there into the world's largest outdoor museum. Travel the hiking paths. Go. You know what Drew did on the anniversary? Drew gets out there on the anniversary of Antietam, and they did the forced march, AP Hills march from Harpers Ferry to Antietam.
What a
Amazing! Guy. You can do that too with Civil War Trails. So get out there, make some history of your own. And if you take a picture with a sign posted on social media, use the hashtag #SignSelfie for a chance to help other people learn about Civil War Trails.
That's right.
Here we go, guys. That was perfectly placed. Marketing, it's all there.
It's all
there.
All
there. So I think, Bo, cheers to you, good sir. Nathan, a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, sir.
And let's go.